Welcome to this Java Break with BASIS. Since it was first introduced in 2010, BASIS's Browser User Interface, or BUI, has continued to evolve and has opened new doors for efficient web application development and deployment. BUI technology allows you to deliver your GUI apps in an instant as a web app running on any modern browser and without the requirement of a JVM or interpreter on the client. Welcome everyone. My name is Paul Yeomans with BASIS International, and today I'll be joined by Nico Spence, our Chairman and CEO. Let's take a look at today's agenda. First of all, we'll explain what BASIS's BUI is. Then we'll talk about maximizing BUI performance and fine-tuning the appearance of your app to look more like a web application and less like one transplanted from the desktop. Then we'll talk about automating your BUI deployment. You can get your BBJ app running as a BUI web app in just a few minutes. The updated BUI API handles this with ease. We'll also learn about the new BUI load image, busy indicator, and end action features. And then of course, we'll take your questions. So first of all, what is BASIS's BUI? BASIS has created a little magic in delivering web apps in an instant. BUI is the Browser User Interface technology, where you write once and run everywhere. As a developer, are you feeling pressured to make your existing GUI apps browser capable? Well, go BUI. Wondering how to build web apps for multiple platforms from a single code set? Again, go BUI. So what's this BUI? It's been undergoing continuous improvements since we launched it in June of 2010. Back at that time, we referred to it as a truly watershed moment for any application developer, especially Java developers and those who've been writing in our language, BBJ. BBJ applications are able to run in any modern browser, and that includes the mobile world, smartphones, tablets, phablets, and more. And again, no JVM or interpreter is required on the client. BASIS technology-powered web apps are a URL away. When we launched the BUI technology back in 2010, it provided developers with a dramatic improvement to the entire process of developing and deploying web applications for the internet. You would write and test in BBJ, and then within that environment, test it in BUI, and then quickly deploy it using the built-in Jetty web server and a URL. What about Barista, you asked, our rapid application development framework? Since Barista apps are GUI BBJ apps, they too can run in a browser. How does this BUI work? Developers of GUI BASIS apps are piggybacking on BBJ's leverage of the Google Web Toolkit, the GWT or GWT. This enables new and existing GUI applications to run in the browser with little or no code changes. Using GWT, BASIS cross-compiles BBJ into optimized JavaScript. Automatically, this allows it to work across all modern browsers, be it IE, Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and many more. Why did BASIS decide to use GWT? In quoting Google from a couple years back, they wrote, "Writing web apps today is a tedious and error-prone process. Developers can spend 90% of their time working around browser quirks. In addition, building, reusing, and maintaining large JavaScript codebases and AJAX components can be difficult and fragile." The Google Web Toolkit, GWT, eases this burden by allowing developers to quickly build and maintain complex, yet highly performant JavaScript front-end application in the Java programming language. GWT maps traditional GUI controls, the buttons, text boxes, drop-down lists, etc., to native browser controls. And once again, no JVM is required on the client side. It skips all the web start and thin client prerequisites, and it merely requires a JavaScript-enabled web browser. BASIS BUI provides another reason for BBJ to be your development language of choice. It is Java made easy.
So, what does a BUI app look like? It's remarkably similar to the SysGUI version of the same app. Of course, the browsers will influence the look and feel. So here we have the rendering of our BBJ download page, which is a BBJ application. Let's have a look at another example. This is a pop email server app written in BBJ. This is what it looks like in SysGUI. And then that's the same app running in BUI. Another example would be our poweredbybbj.com app that's used by our reseller community to order product, to manage their licensing. And that same app running inside of a browser, inside of the BASIS website. Let's talk a little bit about the fine-tuning of our BUI apps. One of the great things we've added to the new version of BBJ is a better looking BUI app. Now, BBJ's BUI relies on cascading style sheets, CSS, and it uses the GWT base CSS file with BASIS custom definitions. And that controls how the app is rendered on desktops or in mobile browsers. The good news is that we've done a makeover to the default CSS in BBJ. We've added new CSS selectors to BBJ controls, nearly 1,000 modifications to 800 controls. We've added numerous new selectors. So a bit like this paintbrush effect on the left-hand side is the new, on the right is the old. Let's give you some other examples. We've revamped the appearance of all BBJ controls, added gradients, drop shadows, outlines, colors. It delivers a fresh look with improved interaction for the users, provides a unified consistency, and in this little subtle example here, we'll see how this is the keyboard focus, whereas the old one wasn't easy to see that this one didn't have focus and this one did. Here you'll notice the little light blue colored background to the button tells us which it is. And similarly, you couldn't necessarily easily determine which is read-only, which is disabled, whereas now we can easily determine the difference between those two. It improves the accessibility, increasing the size of interactive components. The old input D looked like this, and the new one, a little bit more space, a little bit more accessibility for the user to click on the date that he wants to select. We've improved the layouts. So you'll notice here in this very complex example where we have the file chooser, notice the big difference between the top and the bottom, the old and the new. Standardized list controls, new improved icons, improved layout, grid headers, full panel with grid lines, consistent fonts and sizes, and standardized buttons. We've enhanced the hover, focus, and read-only indicators. This is specifically true for message boxes, authentication dialogues. That's what the old would look like. That's what the new does. Any new or existing BBJ app receives these benefits automatically. All you have to do is update to BBJ 14 to access the new theme. It results in your BUI app looking and running better than ever before. We've even added selectors for complex controls. So message box example, we added a 2-pixel colored border to the components, making it easier to visualize the components. And there's full documentation on BUI CSS component styles. Look it up in our online documentation, which you'll notice that we have several new selectors that can now be controlled via your custom CSS. And that leads to a better looking BUI app. So in this little example, we've replaced the default image with pure CSS. There's no image required. And this icon on the right with access denied, the icon is infinitely scalable and remains sharp and clear. That's because it's been rendered by the JavaScript engine within the browser. A better looking BUI app is now available to you. Some good examples here of some of the error messages and or how we can even style various components of a grid with different colors and different fonts. Let me now hand over to Paul again to talk about maximizing BUI's performance.
Thanks, Nico. When we design a distributed application, the client and server work together to manipulate data, perform calculations, and present information to the user. The communication between the client and server can be broken down into 3 broad categories. Server to client. The BBJ application running on the server sends data to the client without waiting for a response. BBJ automatically optimizes batches of operations in this category to improve performance. The second category is client to server. This would include traffic events like on-button push event. For the most part, the client sends events to the server without waiting for any sort of response. The event object typically contains additional parameters relating to the event, such as the width, height of a resized window, or the XY location of a moved window. Because this information is delivered to the server as part of the act of delivering the event, it is immediately available to the program as soon as the event is received. The third category is server to client to server, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. They would include methods in which the application queries the client for some dynamic language that cannot be cached on the server. These would include the BBJ edit box, get text, and BBJ checkbox is selected. When a BBJ application executes a line, it comes to a complete standstill while the server sends that request to the client, then waits for the client to send back the response. If the application sends several messages to the client that don't require a response, such as server to client category 1, followed by a single message that does require a response, category 3, the application must wait for the client to process all pending messages, then respond to the final message that requires a response. In some cases, this can add hundreds of milliseconds to the delay. If that round trip hadn't been introduced, the client would have been able to continue working through processing those backlogged messages while the application running on the server moved on to new work. Reducing round trips dramatically improves BUI performance.
So how do we avoid these synchronous round trips? Let's have a look here at this example. Here we have the onList click event handler for a BBJ list box. In the first version, the BBJ list box getSelectedIndex forces a round trip back to the client, typically introducing a delay of 100 milliseconds or more. In the second version, BBJ list click event getSelectedIndex retrieves the value that was delivered to the server as part of the original event, so there's no additional round trip, shaving off at least 100 milliseconds, depending upon the latency of your installation. So we had a sample code that we actually ran, I think, back at our last TechCon, where we showed how by using form validation events and we added the payload to the event itself, we're able to reduce the round trips significantly. The example we used was linking into a server on the West Coast and trying to retrieve control values from Albuquerque to California from our Albuquerque office. With form validation, we were down to some 60 odd milliseconds versus 170 milliseconds without form validation. So we strongly encourage you to retrofit your code with that functionality. Here's an app that looks up information about a surname in a name database. That same app running in the browser looks like it has a lot of the trappings of the browser running around it. So how can we clean that up? Well, firstly, that title bar looks a bit out of place in a web page. And it would be nice if we used all of the available space. So let's try a few tweaks. We create the window with no title bar. We'll optionally add a separate close button. And we can maximize the window to use the full browser client area. We can also use the native browser list version of the list button and provide a better user experience on mobile devices. More about that in our next Java break. And the size and position of all the controls is based on the available space. And we can add a resize handler to resize the controls when the user resizes the browser. As we said earlier, we can also define what happens when the user exits a BUI app. We have custom end actions. So here's a piece of sample code that shows how we can set the end action. We could either set it to another BUI app to run or to a URL to go to.
Thanks, Nico. With BUI and your creation of web applications, there are some considerations. First of all, it's not the best solution for handling rich media and gaming. However, it is the most efficient methodology for data-driven mobile solutions. It's ideal for extending an existing business application. Single code set for multiple platforms. which gives you a huge development effort savings. It's much easier to maintain over the life of the app, and updates are simpler. Just publish the new version to your server, and all client devices receive it. Getting your BBJ app running as a BUI web app is a simple matter of spending a few minutes in the Enterprise Manager to register the application, define the runtime parameters, and optionally define a custom CSS file and browser or home screen icon. To launch that BUI app in the browser, right-click on the URL field, copy to a clipboard, select Launch, and run it in the default browser of your choice. The Enterprise Manager interface is perfect for getting started and for casually defining a few BUI apps from time to time. However, BUI also has an extensive API for publishing and managing apps. As of BBJ 14.0, BUI programs come with even more optional configuration properties, including load images, a super fast replacement for your traditional splash screen, and custom end actions that define what the browser does when the BUI app releases. As more configuration parameters become available, developers have expressed the desire to automate this process by programmatically registering and configuring those BUI apps. Those requests have been heard.
Let's discuss automating your BUI deployment. Everything in the Enterprise Manager can also be driven by the API. BBJ's robust API gives you access to controlling BUI deployment. You can publish and manage your application from the Enterprise Manager's BUI configuration, or you can use the new API to streamline the process, saving you time. Here's a quick example of what it looks like in Barista. When Barista ships, it has an automated BUI deployment, so that's governed by the API. If you right-click on a menu item, you can launch it in the browser. That'll launch in the browser, and that's immediately dynamically added to the BUI configuration and served up via the built-in Jetty web server. So we have a Hello World app identifying its environment, and we have a sample program to publish to the BUI web server. So let's have a look at some of that code. This app simply returns the information from the info 3,6 function to determine the mode and report whether it's running in fat client, thin client, or the BUI environment. And then this little sample code here is the sample API code used to publish the app, given information like the path to the source program, the config.bbx that it'll use, and information relating to all of the other configuration options that you would see in Enterprise Manager. The sample code is available to you in the last Advantage magazine. One of the other considerations, of course, is that the app server will see a snapshot of what has been published. So when you associate an image and CSS resource with the BUI app, it gets you that snapshot view. And you can then, via the API, inform the server when the CSS file is changed. You could do it via the Enterprise Manager, but that would be tedious. Instead, you can write a small update program that can run with every edit to CSS or a change to a registered image. So here's some sample code, again available in our Advantage magazine, a program that shows how you can refresh a BBJ BUI app via the API, unpublishing and then republishing the app with the new information, the new CSS file. Getting started with BUI could not be easier. There's documentation to guide you. We'd encourage you to go and have a look at the BBJ BUI Getting Started document. Again, available from the download page. The link is there. And one of the considerations might be what BBJ code doesn't work in BUI. There's very little really. Control validation, we strongly recommend you use form validation. Control validation would force a ton of round trips, thereby making your application too slow. BBJ data-bound grid, not yet implemented. BBJ print preview is not implemented. You could print to the PDF and view in the browser. BBJ scroll bar, drag and drop is not implemented, but you could mimic that with mouse tracking. Mouse to wheel interface is not implemented, and clipboard verbs and functions. So as you'll see, very little that might affect a real application that would run in the browser.
Thanks, Nico. In addition to adding full documentation for the existing BUI API, BBJ 14 also adds several new features, as I mentioned a moment ago, most of which are accessible through both the interactive Enterprise Manager interface and the programmatic API. Those would be the load image, the end action, and the busy indicator. The default load image still displays this animated blue and white progress bar to create, customize, and display a BUI busy indicator. But you can now define a customized default load image and custom load images for individual apps. The load image displays almost instantly as the page loads, instead of waiting until the interpreter associated with that BUI app is up and running. Because it displays so quickly, it is a perfect way to present the user with an application splash screen or any other customized loading indicator. We've had many requests for developer-defined application termination actions in place of the default of just replacing the application in the browser with a click to reload application message. As of BBJ 14.0, custom end actions are definable both at the global level and for individual apps. There are several kinds of end actions. You can continue to clear the browser window, the original and still the default action, but show a custom message in place of the default message. Or you can chain them to another BUI app, perhaps one that acts as a main menu, or chain to a particular URL. For more flexibility, BBJ BUI Manager even allows for changing the end action dynamically in a running BUI app. In all cases, the end action takes effect when the app terminates, typically by executing a release statement. Another new feature is the busy indicator. Traditional desktop applications typically indicate that they are busy by setting the wait cursor. While this still works with BUI apps in the desktop browser, mobile browsers don't have cursors, so they need some other way to let the user know that they are busy. The most common way to indicate that a browser-based application is temporarily busy is to dim the screen and display an animation with a short message to let the user know what's happening. Developers can now easily accomplish this with the new busy indicator. Here's the code to create, customize, and display a BUI busy indicator. Several of these features have led us right into the next Java break, which will be mobile apps made easy with BUI.
Thanks, Paul. It's definitely time for your web app makeover, and what better tool to use than BASIS BUI. Some of the source code that we showed you today and more reading can be found in our Advantage Magazine resources: BUI to the max, amp up and fine tune, default CSS gets a makeover, automate BUI deployment with the API, and a bountiful selection of new CSS selectors. So go and have a look at that. If you missed seeing the sample code today, want to see it in more detail, go to the online Advantage magazine or get a hard copy. So let's summarize. We covered what is BASIS BUI, we spoke about maximizing BUI performance, and finally we spent some time talking about automating BUI deployment. Let's take your questions.